Okay, welcome everybody. I don't know what number this is in our webinar series, but it's been quite enlightening and we've had some very positive feedback. And this was suggested by some of the viewers. They would like a discussion around what we as an expert committee feel about the future of MS therapies. So I'd just like to welcome Ruth Dobson, a colleague of mine who works in preventive neurology, Stefano Placino, who is a basic sciences / clinician, neurologist in Cambridge, and he's working on regenerative medicine. And we've got Professor Anna Williams from the regenerative medicine group in Edinburgh. So a really good panel to discuss the future. So I'm going to actually start with Stefano. I'm going to give a hypothetical to break the ice. Just imagine that you're now in charge of an MS Society's R&D budget and you want to fund a research program around this unmet need of progressive MS, restoring function, and possibly prevention. You know, what would you spend your money on?
That's a good question, Gavin. Is with limited funding or unlimited funding?
Well, just say you've got a lot of money to spend on a strategic project.
Okay, I got a lot of money and I have to deliver this task either medium term or long term. First of all, I would like to emphasize that I believe that beyond inflammation, which I guess is not going to be topic of discussion today, I believe that the future of MS, because this is the title of this webinar, still relies on the understanding of the disease and how it evolves, transforms, and progresses over the years. And this is a very ambitious task, which implies a very full integration of cellular work, animal research, and clinical data, including imaging. So in terms of managing the portfolio of the MS Society, should we have unlimited funding, I would have basically two options in front of me. One would be a medium-term option, where I believe that creating an alliance with small and medium enterprises and pharmas, a model which has been already investigated by initiatives like the Progressive MS Alliance, would be significantly helpful to deliver a very focused drug discovery program in order to facilitate and accelerate the development and transition of promising new therapeutics into early clinical trials. If I would have much higher budget in the long term, I think would be exciting to favor research on biological processes, possibly redundant biological processes, which might have implication in multiple diseases, including late-stage MS. And I can give you a list of the biological processes that I believe might be interesting to study within a program. I can tell you cellular metabolism and energetics, which is something I'm very much in love with, but also mechanism of cytotoxicity, axonal transport, but also cell identity and differentiation. And I guess that putting together these strategies within an MS Society body of investment would help significantly the acceleration of discoveries towards what we today call the future of MS, but eventually would be just tomorrow.
So Anna, can I come to you now?
Yes, thank you.
So what did you do your investment in?
So I enjoyed this question, and I've been thinking about it for the last few days. And actually, I run a research group of 12 people, so I put it to them and said, "What would you do with it?" And I got some very interesting answers. But I think that what we are missing at the moment is a good measure of neuroprotection. And so I think if I was running the MS Society, I know that the biology is good and I know that the drug discovery is happening and that people are trying to do different models of neuroprotection, but I think we need to measure it better. And so I do not think we're going to get this out of MRI scanning in terms of a direct measure. And so I think I would put money into PET scanning. I think I would put money into PET scanning to look for measures of neurodegeneration that we can then try and reverse, because we can do as much biological research as we like, and we do some fabulous research, but if we can't test these pathways, manipulating these pathways in people, we are going to get nowhere. So I would like to do a PET program, perhaps looking at synapse, PET ligands or axon or PET ligands or oligonucleotide precursor PET ligands to try and work out whether what we're doing is actually directly neuroprotective. So that's my plan.
So there is some work that's come out of Finland on looking at synaptic density in terms of
Absolutely.
and it's quite profound how much synaptic loss there is in MS.
And I agree, and I think this looks like, from animal models as well, it's quite early, and therefore we can actually do something to manipulate this, up front, because if we just wait for the neurons to die, then there's not going to be much we can manipulate. But synapses are plastics, and maybe that's something we can do. So that would be my money pot.
So I'm getting a theme here. So Stefano wants to create a system for drug discovery, essentially. You want readouts for proof of biology in terms of early stage trials. Yeah. So now I'm going to flip it to Ruth. Ruth, you've got a completely different worldview of this, haven't you?
I've got a totally different worldview. It's very interesting listening to those two answers, because I think, thinking about MS prevention and how little really is known about the biological pathways that lead to the development of MS in the first place, there's actually a huge area of unmet need. And I think if I was the MS Society, you're faced with this sort of choice between do you invest a lot of money in something that actually is very high risk, it's not going to give a readout potentially for many years, it doesn't fit into a sort of typical research grant program where you get a readout and a definite answer within 3 years. But I think what I would want to invest in is I would want to take this very long-sighted view and potentially set up cohorts that then give you a long-term readout. So setting up cohorts of people potentially at risk of MS, but also in collaboration with other disease areas. So for example, looking at wider autoimmune disease spectrum, where MS is not going to be your only readout. And potentially by also looking even earlier than childhood and actually looking at pregnancy and starting to collect data with short-term readouts, but then also much longer-term readouts as well, and to invest in that level of infrastructure, because I think that's actually what's really needed. In terms of research budget, it's very interesting actually hearing Anna talking about using different readouts to look at the biology, and I think maybe there is a role for that also in prevention research and actually trying to think about how we examine for pre-symptomatic stage. We all know about radiologically isolated syndrome, but probably by that point that the ball has already started rolling. And actually, if you start to get more biologically relevant readouts from novel imaging technology, can you go and use those and look at people at sort of earlier on the disease trajectory than symptomatic disease or even MRI-based disease? So I would, it would have to be very, very novel and high-risk projects, though. But I think you have to plough some money into the high-risk stuff if you're really going to address prevention.
I entirely agree. I think that would be really
cool. It'd be really cool, but nobody wants to fund it because it's too high risk.
Well, no one wants to fund PET either, but But we in Scotland would like to think we're an amazing test bed for this, because we have 5 million people, which is why we've been much better off with coronavirus than you lot. But because there's less of us, and people tend to stay. We've got a fantastic tracking system, so and we've got high risk of MS, so it'd be a great population to look at a population epidemiological level.
I mean, I think
my pet ligand story, and then we could actually start trying to work out both prevention but early treatment, and then actually patient treatment when neurodegeneration happens.
Yeah.
So,
and I think the other
Ruth, that sounds great.
I think the other thing that you have in Scotland is you have amazing epidemiological tracking of your population, far better than we have in England.
Yeah, no, it's right, because everybody has a number, and that number stays with them, so we can find them, which is helpful.
In England, everyone has a number, but it just gets filed in a drawer and nobody ever looks at it.
I think what Scotland has been showing, though, is that there's clearly an epidemic of MS. The incidence and prevalence is soaring, and we have to do something about it. Stefano, I want to come back to you. You said you're really into energetics. Okay.
Yeah.
So tell me about your plans to manipulate energetics. Okay.
But the plan, first of all, is to understand energetics. First of all, we have to understand how things work. And the energetics is a very complex and exciting field of investigation, which has multiple implications in different cells. So it is, on one way, it is commonly shared, but on the other hand, can be exclusive for a few cell types. So I think that the cellular energetics is important because it might be it might be kind of Janus phase. It might be working one way for cells like structural cells of the brain, the one out of which we are expecting, what do you say, restoration of function. And we need to provide with additional resources those cells which inevitably become vulnerable in the very late stage of MS. On the other hand, the very same principles apply also to those cells which are responsible for inflammation body in the brain, but however they are controlled by different cellular energetic pathways. So in the way of studying cellular energetics, we have to be very, very careful in distinguishing how they work in different cell types and whether we might need a much deeper understanding of how formation and consumption of energy takes place in the cells, and whether we can identify therapeutic targets whenever the energy and the production energy apparatus of the cell become dysfunctional. I can give an example that the way TCA cycles, which is a way by which energetics are formed into the mitochondria, which are the central core of the energetic apparatus of the cells. The way all this works in inflammatory cells, in immune cells, macrophages and microglia, is completely different from the way it works in neurons or oligodendrocytes. So we have to be very careful in the basic biology applied to cellular energetics, and we have expectation of identifying new therapeutic targets which might be, drugged and interfere with small molecules and compounds. So that's why I'm so in love with cellular energetics.
So, this is now outside of the MS field, but in the healthy aging field / dementia field, there's a whole lot of work going on dietary manipulation of central energetics. Do you think there is any therapeutic targets that have emerged from the dietary manipulation of CNS energetics?
Yeah, that's where I was going to finish up with. What I think is important, keeping an eye on, keeping a major focus on MS, is to be open to cross-contamination with non-MS fields. And you gave an example of aging or longevity, but there is also example from cancer and from autoimmunity. And the mitochondria and cellular energetics from aging and cancer are incredibly instructive for the MS field. And looking at mitochondrial complex functions, it's a way to look at how energy is produced and consumed in cells, and it's a way to understand whether there is commonalities between two apparently different scenarios, or whether there is things which can be shared and which can help us identifying common therapeutic targets and to test drugs which are already working in longevity and aging. One example is the very, very unspecific medication metformin, which has emerged out of very recent studies conducted by Robin Franklin in Cambridge, which possesses multiple targets. And some of these targets might also help production of additional energy resources into the cells, other than affecting directly the differentiation of very young mammalian progenitor cells into fully functional oligodendrocytes. So the two key message I wanted to stress out with you is the potential cross-fertilization with non-MS discussions, but also the promiscuity of targets, which might help, hitting different pathways on different cell targets.
So, so this is a thing we should probably all discuss. Intermittent fasting and ketogenic diets have become big news. A lot of our patients are just adopting these based on cross-contamination and recommendations on social media. So what are you telling people with MS who come to you with intermittent fasting and ketogenic diets? Are you supporting them?
So we have to distinguish very carefully what is done in the laboratory, and it is controlled. It is applicable to inbred, which means genetically identical laboratory animals, and what is done in the wild with humans and patients. So whenever I manage to speak with a patient asking what is the value of intermittent fasting or 16/8 fasting or dietary restriction, I try to have a kind of broad discussion and try to match the request of the patient with his or her own expectation. And if the expectation is that he or she will be able to reproduce in that specific case what is described by media and scientific papers, my short answer is forget it. But in terms of promise of these new regimes of controlling calorie consumption and production and cell metabolism, I think there is a great promise. But we need to investigate at basic science level. And going back to what Anna was proposing with a PET imaging program and investment, something to consider would be the development of biomarkers, including approaches like liquid biopsy or liquid biopsy-like identification of markers of response to what we call scientifically perturbation. Change in the diet is a perturbation to the system. And if we manage to have new sensible biomarkers able to guide us towards the understanding of how these perturbations can change the outcome of MS, then it would be a very good news for us.
Okay, so I'm going to stick on energetics. Ruth, I want to come to you because, as you, you've been responsible for some of the meta-analyses behind childhood and adolescent obesity, being a risk factor for MS. Do you have any concepts of how that is driving the increased risk?
So I think, I think that the childhood and adolescent obesity association with MS is becoming stronger. I think the mechanisms remain relatively poorly understood. I think one question is sort of whether it directly drives the MS risk or whether it's doing so via a secondary mechanism. I strongly suspect it's not to do with sort of cellular energetics that it's driving this, but more to do with the a pro-inflammatory obesogenic environment. So we know that childhood and adolescent obesity is associated with long-term risks of other autoimmune diseases, of cancer. It's a strong inflammatory driver and process rather than sort of a specific effect that we see in MS. And what we also see is that it appears to enhance the risk associated with other MS risk factors, particularly in Swedish studies associated with adolescent EBV infections, infectious mono. So I think what a lot of the sort of genetic and Mendelian randomization work and the observational data doesn't tell us about mechanisms, and that's really a very strongly missing aspect. But I suspect it is shared mechanism across a number of diseases rather than an MS-specific mechanism that's driving that. I think the other thing that really we haven't understood is with this huge shift in towards increasing obesity, which is obviously continuing to go on. Is it something that's, is it actually a shared risk? Is it something else that's driving the obesity that's also driving the MS? Are there actually things in our diet that are doing this rather, and obesity is one endpoint and inflammatory disease is a second endpoint. But we know that fat cells associated with obesity are not, they're not biologically neutral. They don't just sort of sit there causing someone to be obese. Actually, they're involved in a number of cellular mechanisms. They're involved in a number of sort of hormonal dysregulation. So it's very complex untangling that. There's been some very nice work showing that the association of MS with earlier age of menarche is almost exclusively driven by adolescent obesity. And I think, that tells us something around the interactions between risk factors that are observed in epidemiological studies as well.
Okay, so the problem we have though is the government knows about this epidemic of childhood and adolescent obesity, and despite incredibly good behavioural data about how to reduce it, we don't have much response from our politicians. So.
I would say, my argument would be that actually it's not about behavioural data. Obesity is a disease of poverty. It's if you can't afford to buy nutrient-rich, less calorie-dense food, the cheap food is obesogenic. It's poverty has a huge role to play, and I suspect that the reason that politicians haven't engaged with this argument is because actually they don't want to fix poverty. But anyway, I'm going to get off my political soapbox.
Okay. So Anna, let's go back to you now, because you did mention biomarkers. So there are quite a few trials running at the moment of remyelination / neurorestorative therapies. Can we actually measure remyelination in the clinic, do you think, to a point where you've got proof of biology at the moment?
No, I don't think we can. No, we can imply it. Using MRI, we can imply it using visual evoked potentials that get better, as in the latencies get shorter, and we can imply it with people getting better clinically, but I think we can't guarantee that any of this is remyelination, and I think it's a big problem. Because if I could make a list of drugs that in a mouse or a rat or a zebrafish or even a monkey would improve remyelination, but if we can't actually test them properly with a direct measure of remyelination rather than an indirect measure, then it's going to be incredibly difficult to get things into clinical practice. Now, I don't think that means that we just give up now and not do any trials into that, because that would be very negative. But I think what we are in now is a really good place, because we've got lots of things we can test, but we now need to sort out the trials to work out how we're going to test it. And that's why I want to do PET, but at the moment we can't do that so well. How are we going to test it? Who should we do it? Who should we give it to? Because that's the other question, is what patients would be the best patients to try remyelination therapies on, and then actually get our trials right. It's a fabulous place to be, so that's very hopeful, but we've not sorted it at all, in my view. And we have to do what we can do, which is what we are doing, which are the VAPs and the MRI scans and the clinical measures, and then we look at neurofilament, for example. But it's a bit long end stage, and if we want to engage pharma companies, they want a quick outcome. We give this drug, it does this, we can measure it, and if we can't do that, then they're not interested, frankly. The other problem is that remyelination is going to be slow. And, the inflammatory drug trials, or the anti-inflammatory drug trials, were like 3 months, 6 months, a year. Neuroprotection trials are going to have to be 2 years plus, in my view. And with anything else, we're just not going to know. So it's really difficult, but it's worth doing, in my view.
So could I ask you to criticize or critique the oportunumab development program, because oportunumab antilingo-1 is probably the agent that's furthest ahead in terms of the pipeline?
I think we have to give Biogen credit for developing the antilingo-1 story, because it was really the first inverted commas drug therapy that could improve remyelination in an animal model. And then they've taken it all the way to a clinical trial, and you have to give them credit for actually doing that. I don't think many people think it's going to work, because it's an antibody, and it's an antibody with its aim is to enhance oligodendrocyte precursor cell differentiation. So by definition, it needs to get into the brain, because that's where the oligodendrocyte precursor cells are. And that's where you're going to stimulate them to differentiate. And antibodies are just really tricky to get into the brain. And so, bearing in mind that even they predict that, it's well less than 1%, so about 0.1% of their antibody gets into the brain, the likelihood of it then working is slightly low. But I think in terms of that working, no, I don't think that's ever going to become something useful. But in terms of them laying down the pathway for other pro-remyelination therapies, I think they've done a very good job, because it started the ball rolling. And on the back of that have been various other ones, such as the clemistine trial and the baroxetine trial, which have been trying to do it, but at least they penetrate the blood-brain barrier. It's a very different world than the anti-inflammatory world, where actually you don't want them to penetrate the blood-brain barrier, really. It's going to affect on the peripheral immune system, but these ones have got to get into the brain. And so I'm pretty negative that the antilingo-1 trial will turn into a useful therapy for patients, but I'm pretty positive the fact that they have taken something from basic biology and got it into the clinic, and it's going to be good for everything else coming behind it. So I think they deserve some credit, but...
So I've got a conflict. I sit on the steering committee, and we're having a real challenging time designing the phase 3 trial. terms of what the outcome should be.
Do we have freedom for a question, Gavin?
Yes, Stefano, no problem. Yeah.
I have a question to Anna, because I haven't been following much the Lingo trial, but I'm so curious to know, because Anna has been publishing recently very, very breakthrough science looking at human MS-specific oligodendrocytes, applying fantastic single-cell RNA-seq technology. And I was wondering whether, based on her knowledge, Anna would think that the negative data of the trial rely on the intrinsic caveats of the monoclonal antibody approach to penetrate the brain, or whether there was something wrong in the preclinical work, or whether, at last, the antibody works, even though to a very limited extent, but there is very little oligodendrocytes to promote, OPCs to promote becoming mature oligodendrocytes in the MS brain.
Yeah, thank you, Stefano. Basically, the controversy at the moment in my field is whether remyelination happens, well, one, at all, which I think it does, and most pathologists do. But secondly, is how it actually happens, because the sort of classic from all of the animal models previously has been that you need an oligodendrocyte stem cells, a precursor cell, and that this needs to make a new oligodendrocyte, and that new oligodendrocyte then goes and remyelinates. So that's been the dogma really for ever since I've started, and before that. But with some new really interesting studies, the suggestion has been that actually maybe some of the old oligodendrocytes that are still there in the MS lesions that have been demyelinated can grow out new processes and put processes down and do remyelination. And it all started with an interesting study in Sweden, where they looked at how much radioactivity were in people post nuclear bomb testing, and working out that in the remyelinated areas of the brain, what people thought were the remyelinated areas, it looks like the oligodendrocytes were old, so that they retain the radioactivity. So it's quite interesting studies. And now people have found that in mouse, this can happen, so the oligodendrocytes can grow out new processes, and that also now in zebrafish, that we've done some work on that as well. So it looks like there are now two processes. You don't have to make new ones, you can also use old ones to do it. And so if you can use old ones to do it, then pro-differentiation drugs are not going to work. But I think, again, when one gets into controversy, usually both sides are correct. There's not one person is right and everybody else is wrong, but everyone is correct. So I think there is no doubt that in MS brain we can see things that look like old oligodendrocytes making new myelin, and there's no doubt that also they come from stem cells. And the question is which ones are the better ones at doing it? So I suspect pro-remyelination drugs will work because they will make the oligodendrocyte precursor cells make new oligodendrocytes, and they might be better. If it's like it is in zebrafish, they will be the better ones. But it may also be that old ones make it as well, and it may be that in some people more old ones make it than new ones, and other people more new ones make it than old ones, because as Stefano says, we are not genetically identical, we're very different, and this may be different. And I think that's really interesting, and it's something that I'm interested in as well.
So I'm getting the feeling, though, you're quite positive about remyelination being a realistic therapeutic strategy going forward in the next 5 to 10 years, and we shouldn't maybe raise expectations too high about the current crop of trials, but we'll get there. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I do. So, if I didn't think that, I wouldn't be able to get up in the morning, or at least go to work, because that's effectively what we try and do, is to understand remyelination so that we can promote it. I do think that it will be of benefit, and I think we just have to be patient that something has happened, it's been useful, trying to work out how to do these trials. We need to do them better, and we need better drugs, and once we can test them better and have better drugs, then we will get results which I think will be helpful.
Okay, Stefan, I want to come to you now at more advanced disease. So one of the expectations, and when you go out and survey people with MS, is they're expecting these therapies to restore function, not slow down or even flatline it. So Stefano, what in your mind mean, what does restoration mean from a biological perspective, and how are we going to measure that and deal with it?
You know, restoration is very easy to define semantically. Restoration is re-establishment of something which was partially lost. And in terms of function, if there is a function which is affected, which becomes dysfunction, restoration is when that dysfunction becomes function again. In terms of biology, I think we have to face against a number of challenges and to a number of definitions. And the first of which is distinguishing between partial and complete restoration of function, which is always discussed in the field, especially when dealing with patients who have great expectation from these promises that they read on newspapers and media. So in MS, I think something which is critical, and again, we go back to the concept of biomarkers and the concept of stratification of patients and identification of patients for a given approach. So I think that one day we will end up with a personalized medicine approach or stratified medicine approach to MS. The key question is the window of opportunity. Because in terms of biology, I think there is enough evidence coming from animal models, from preclinical research, even from organotypic cell cultures, which is a way to model a lesion in a dish. I think there is enough evidence that if we make new myelin in the presence of an anatomically intact axon, we are able to restore the function which was partially lost as a consequence of the loss of myelin. There is not yet full evidence that we are able to regrow axons after they have been anatomically transected or severed in full from the initial starting point to the final part. So the biology is there, and as Anna was alluding, the biology is strong and it is exciting, and it is 40 years of biology on the restoration of function as a proof of concept in, I would say, artifactual reductionistic approaches modeling a specific aspect of the disease. What is going to be challenging, and what is a real challenge, especially for trials like the Lingo one, but there would be metformin, there would be there is clemastine, there is other potentially promising medications, is how to identify, stratify the patients and have realistic expectation in terms of outcome measures and how to measure the outcomes of the function that we want to restore. At the moment, what we can achieve is slowing down progression, which is already a big achievement. So we can reduce the pace of progression in MS by acting on multiple targets. We are not yet fully capable to restore a function that is permanently lost. We are able to restore a function which is temporarily lost. But again, this is difficult to justify without going back to the biology, because the biology of a function which is only temporarily lost might be incredibly complex.
Yeah, so one of the things that we as an MS community are not doing in our remyelination and thinking about restoration is active rehabilitation exercise, which happens in the spinal cord injury field. They would never think about a neurorestorative trial in a spinal cord injury without having a very proactive rehab program. So, you got any thoughts about how we would incorporate the learnings from the spinal cord injury field into MS?
Yeah, that was the second part of my answer. Actually, there is already very early rehab and even more sophisticated approach applied to MS. Not as I would say widespread approach or established approach as for spinal cord injury and traumatic brain injury. The major reason for this still partial application of standard or even innovative rehabilitation approaches is the fact that MS is not a fixed disease. MS is continuously evolving over time, while conceptually TBI or spinal cord injury are meant to be fixed disease. There is an injury, and then anything that comes as secondary damage after the disease is not evolving much because there is no flares of disease, which is instead a very common feature in MS. But I can tell you that combining classical and standard rehab approaches plus prosthetics, for example, and a neuroprosthetic is by definition something which can help patients to regain, even partially, a function which is lost. So combining brain-computer interfaces, rehabilitation approaches, smart devices and neuroprosthetics, that's a way, possibly not a biological way, not the way we are expecting to correct the function that is lost, to help the patient correcting the function.
Okay. So I'm going to go, I'll come back to you. I know I'm leaving Ruth out. I'll come back to Ruth after the next question. But David's going to ask a question there. Maybe Anna should deal. It's about sleep. What is your opinion on the importance of sleep for oligodendrocyte regeneration and remyelination, please? Because I've never heard of sleep driving remyelination. But
anyway. I'm not sure I'm an expert in this, but sleep is clearly important in preserving neural function. So there's some very nice work from Mike and Nedergaard in Denmark with looking at the glymphatic system. So this is sort of the lymph system of the brain. And if you don't sleep, then this doesn't work properly. And effectively, you can gain things like amyloid in your cells, because it's a sort of washing of the brain system, if you like. Now, its influence in MS, I think, is the glymphatic system in MS. I don't think it's been studied at all, to my knowledge. In terms of oligodendrocytes, I suppose if you're thinking about neural activity, which is not quite the same as sleep, but it is at least neural activity. There's good evidence now that neural activity can drive oligodendrocyte activity, and that happens in learning. And I think there's quite a lot of interest about whether that will happen in rehab. So, if you exercise the bit that's not working, will you get more remyelination in the areas that doing that? And I think that's an interesting thought, and there are people trying to do that with fMRI. So, I think 1, sleep is good. 2, sleep clearly cleanses the brain and therefore reduces the neural degeneration generally as we age. And 3, it might have an effect on oligodendrocytes. And I think there is some evidence it will be useful. That's as far as I can go.
Yeah, well, I think, in basic principles, encouraging good sleep hygiene in our patients, or helping them have good sleep hygiene, is probably a good therapeutic approach. So, Ruth, I'm coming now to you, MS prevention.
Okay.
The 2 big modifiable risk factors is vitamin D and EBV. Should we start with the vitamin D? Okay. Is it feasible to do a vitamin D prevention trial in the current environment?
So I think it is feasible to do a vitamin D prevention trial, but I don't think it's feasible to do a vitamin D prevention trial based only on MS. I think that probably the modification of vitamin D on MS risk also occurs in common with other autoimmune diseases. So there's evidence linking vitamin D deficiency with other autoimmune diseases. I mean, vitamin D is, again, the flavour of the month right now around COVID. So it's sort of hit the spotlight again. I think if you look at pretty much any disease and vitamin D, you'll find a study linking the two. So I don't think there should be an MS-specific sort of process, if you like. I think that also the other thing that we need to be really careful about and give a lot of thought about is when would you target? When would you give the vitamin D? I think if you give it when people have already got MS, it's probably too late. You've missed the boat. And the impact that you see around vitamin D deficiency and MS is actually behavioural modifications, that people are not going out as much. And I think there is we've got some evidence now that that's actually changed, and people with MS have higher levels of vitamin D than the general population because of the supplementation behaviour. So you say, fine, well, do you do it just before people get MS? Do you take people at 18? Do you supplement them then? Well, probably actually, I think as our knowledge around MS prodrome increases, we see that people probably have prodromal MS. The disease has already started, some years prior to clinical development. So probably if you do a vitamin D prevention trial, you have to do it in childhood, or even have to do it in pregnancy. And we've got data from Scandinavian birth cohorts that vitamin D levels at birth, so neonatal vitamin D levels, lower neonatal vitamin D levels do appear to impact on subsequent risk of MS. So I think you probably could do a trial, but I think you'd have to think very carefully about how you set it up. And I think you'd have to think very carefully about your power, because you're going to have potentially a huge lag between intervention and endpoint in a very high risk trial. So you can't just do it in MS, you have to do it across disease areas, or you have to think of surrogate endpoints.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Anna.
Because in Scotland, the Scottish Government advises vitamin D supplements to all children. They haven't funded it yet, but they have advised it, and you can get it from your GPs. So is that the same in England? And if it is happening, then does that mean that the trial is impossible?
So in England, it is funded. It's funded as part of Healthy Start. So it's funded if you live in what is, I don't know if it's funded across the board in all local authorities. It's certainly funded in what are classed as sort of more deprived local authorities. So Pan London, you can get free vitamin D for the first year of your child's life, and actually for the mum, interestingly. So mums get free vitamin D and the babies get free vitamin D as well. There's so much fortification now also of foodstuffs. So if you get any kind of baby weaning, any kind of cereals, it's all fortified. I think the question about whether that makes it impossible is tricky because actually, number one, take up I think is abysmally low, particularly probably in Scotland. If you have to pay for it, it's going to be really, really low. And again, it's probably not going to be getting to those that need it most unless you have a really very active outreach scheme. And I think the second part is, well, what dose they're giving? They're giving a sort of RDA type dose, which we know in adults is around 400. In pregnant women, it's 400. If you're judged high risk, it's 800. And actually, probably this may not be enough. This will get you up to a sort of low normal physiological level, but potentially for any paracrine impact of vitamin D, you probably need to boost your levels higher. So I think you have to think about how you design studies. Again, it comes down to, do you actually treat to target? Because not everybody's response to vitamin D supplementation is the same. And if you're somebody who's lucky enough to live on the south coast and spend every day on the beach, probably you are one of the few people in the UK that's getting enough sun to boost your vitamin D levels. So you may not need that super supplementation. But if you're in Scotland, even if you do get to the beach every day, you're probably still deficient, I'm afraid to break it.
Probably wearing a gill. Yes, exactly. Yes.
Yeah, you will be covered head to toe with only your eyes.
With your waterproof trousers on. And I sort of feel it's a bit like fluoride in toothpaste, don't you think? It's going to just creep in.
I mean, it's creeping in. It's really interesting when you start delving back kind of outside of the neurological literature, but sort of through the wider public health literature, and those studies done in Glasgow around sort of very specific supplementation of specific foodstuffs. So around chapati flour, of vitamin D, and actually the impact of that on public health was potentially huge. And I think it's going to be like folic acid, it's going to be like fluoride in toothpaste. It's just going to come in, and at that point a supplementation trial is going to become impossible.
But maybe that doesn't matter, so that's okay.
But that's I suppose I have relatively less strong feelings around vitamin D supplementation trials, partly because I think vitamin D is going to be coming in anyway, partly because I think we should just be doing it. I suppose there's a benefit for a trial where you can say, well, is there an adverse impact of this? But I think there's so much data now around vitamin D supplementation trials and other illnesses in, showing that actually vitamin D supplementation is safe. In a way, it's like, well, what's, should we just go down the folic acid? Should we just go down the fluoride route? Well, what's the benefit of doing a trial?
Yeah, so I'm getting a feeling it's going to be incredibly difficult for political reasons and getting a vitamin D prevention trial off the ground sometime soon. What about the big one, Epstein-Barr? How far away from an EBV vaccination trial, Ruth?
How far away from an EBV vaccination trial? Well, I think an EBV vaccine is not that far away, and I think this is sort of, somewhere where maybe we have some shared ground almost with the remyelination things that Anna and Stefano were talking about. In a way, there's sort of the tanker is moving and the vaccine is being developed, and it really comes down then to more tricky questions about how would you run a trial to look specifically at MS, because if and when an EBV vaccine becomes available, MS is not going to be top of the list, much as I think everyone on this call would probably love MS to be at the top of the list for everything. We have to be realistic, and it's probably not. So I think it's more a question around when a vaccine becomes available, how do you build up a body of evidence that supports its use within the MS arena? I think that EBV vaccination is going to be developed probably around cancer biology. And I think this is, again, where we have to learn lessons from other fields. and potentially around the prevention of infectious mononucleosis, which does carry a not insignificant morbidity, albeit not mortality. I think it's very interesting when you talk to neurologists versus vaccine development scientists around risks of vaccination. I think whenever I've talked about EBV vaccination to neurologists, there's always been this sort of concern around, well, what about the adverse impact of a vaccination? What if we need EBV? Why, does our human immune system need EBV? We've recently published some preliminary evidence that shows that actually EBV negative people have the same immune response to other vaccine preventable and common diseases such as chickenpox as EBV positive. So probably we don't need EBV at least to produce effective responses against vaccination. And if you talk to a vaccine biologist, they're like, well, of course you don't need EBV. We say the same thing about malaria. Malaria is endemic, but nobody questions the benefits of a malaria vaccine. Although the counter argument to that is that mortality from malaria is huge, and the mortality from EBV is very, very low. So I think it comes down to careful questions around risk benefit. But I think an EBV vaccine will be here within the next few years, and the question really will be, how do you use the launch of any such vaccine to study MS biology better and think about prevention?
So do you think we've got a 5 to 10 year timeline for an EBV vaccine prevention trial?
I think we've got a 5-year timeline around an EBV vaccine becoming available and entering trials, but probably not MS trials. And I think this is the tricky bit. It's how do you use data that is collected how do you multi-purpose data? Okay. Because an MS trial, the readout is going to take 20, 30, 40 years. You have to think very carefully about how you repurpose existing data and how you use one study to answer multiple questions. And I think that's the only way we're going to be able to think about MS prevention trials, is not by setting them up purely as MS prevention trials. MS is too rare, it's too unusual, but how do you use evidence that is being gathered as other part or influence other trials to also give MS as a readout? Or do you gather surrogate endpoints?
Okay. Anyway, I'm getting a feeling from your body language that EBV is a lower hanging fruit than vitamin D supplementation.
EBV is a lower hanging fruit than vitamin D, and it's going to be easier. I think vitamin D, that ship has sailed. I think for many reasons. I think EBV, but I also think actually understanding better the information around interaction between risk factors, and particularly those that act in adolescence. So. You mentioned obesity earlier, so obesity, smoking, and EBV. I think those three kind of lifestyle related diseases, but they're so complex because the interactions with poverty, with other sort of demographic features are huge. And I think the other area where I think we may be able to shed some light or develop MS prevention is actually in first and second and third generation migrants. And I think there's a huge amount of data there where you see very rapidly evolving risks in these groups that they cannot be being driven by genetics, because you don't see change within 1 or 2 generations where things, this is telling us something very specific about lifestyle and about modifiable risk factors. And I think we need to really sort of turn our analytical lens very much on groups that are not well studied previously.
It would be terribly nice to be able to link that, though, with the genetic susceptibilities, wouldn't it?
It would be terribly nice.
Yeah.
And I think
with whole genome sequencing getting cheaper and cheaper, that it would be a missed opportunity if the trial didn't involve that as well, I think.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing that's very helpful around genetics is that your genetics doesn't change. Your epigenetics does, but your genetics itself doesn't change. So, you can study these things, but actually you can genetically sample people at any point during their life or disease course. You're not restricted in the same way that you are with other epidemiological questions. Only, you have to catch them at a certain point. Actually, the beauty of genetics is you can select who you sample, and you can sample them at any point.
Okay, so Ruth, a patient coming into clinic worried about their kids getting MS, you're going to say to them, register for this study. We're going to start a vaccine study in 3 years' time, or 4 years' time, or 5 years' time. I think that's the message we need to get out, that it's practical for people in the MS community, that if they have patients with siblings or children, we are moving towards a vaccine study.
Yeah, we're moving towards vaccine study. And I think the other thing is, in patients who are worried about their children, there's big messages. Your children are still more likely not to get MS than they are to get MS, even though the risk in the children is increased. And there are things, I certainly would advise them all to make sure their children are taking vitamin D supplements now, even without a trial, but be honest about the limitations of what you know.
All right.
I think it's more important in the children than in the adults myself.
Absolutely. I think it's most important in the pregnant women, which is a different question. I think, pregnant women, kids, it's basically your whole life. And but I think the earlier you start, the better.
I agree. That's my advice.
So I'm going to bring this is what my biggest problem in clinic is at the moment, and I'm sure if you're seeing MS patients, you're saying you're getting all these people that are on DMTs and they are inflammatory activity free. They haven't had relapses or MRI activity in the last 4 or 5 years, but they're getting worse. So we've got this what the community is now calling PIRA, progression independent of relapse activity. What do we say to our patients? Because I don't know if you've just seen. And yesterday, NICE turned down supplementation for secondary progressive MS. And we've got this enormous unmet need of secondary progression despite being on a DMT. And I think NICE was suggesting those people shouldn't be on a DMT. They should be off a DMT and see what happens to them. I mean, what kind of advice are you giving these patients, and what kind of hope are you giving these patients for a neuroprotective therapy?
I do see patients, and I think we share the very same feeling of seeing yourself very uncomfortable when they come to you and they complain because they are not given any option, because government and regulatory bodies just reject new promising, or at least importantly promising therapeutics. The advice, in the absence of any medication, the advice is to ask them to be patient, because I'm sure that the future is going to be brighter for MS. So the challenge is a cultural shift, and the cultural shift relies on a very long-term belief, very established belief, that DMTs and those specifically working on the immune system are very unlikely to work on the brain, which is not completely correct. You guys in London are running are going to start the cladribine trial, which was initially developed to target B lymphocytes, but which has also been shown to affect microglia responses in the brain. So something which we have to consider is that the classical view of MS as a T-specific T-cell dependent disease has changed in the last 25 years, that the role of neuroinflammation is complex, and neuroinflammation, which is the inflammation which remains compartmentalized into the brain, plays a major role in progression. And if we want to achieve a reduction of the pace of progression, we have to target neuroinflammation. And that's why I got disappointed yesterday when I read on the news that NICE had rejected siponimod. Siponimod possibly is not a magic drug, but this is a drug which showed a little bit of efficacy in patients with active secondary progressive MS, which are those having a much higher pace of progression, which are those which are transiting from a relapsing remitting MS phase to a full secondary progressive phase. So the advice I give to patients is to be more patient, but I'm sure that we will be addressing these unmet needs in the next 3 to 5 years with the discovery of new therapeutic targets and with the discovery of the role of neuroinflammation in the progression.
Yeah. So Mirella, her question's been up there for a while about, what advice we give our patients. So Mirella, you've just heard it from Stefano. You tell them to be patient, but I think there is something you can do to encourage them to live a healthy brain lifestyle, because there is no doubt, at least in the non-MS space, that exercise, possibly good sleep hygiene, all those things that have been shown to lower your risk of getting dementia, probably is applicable to the MS brain as to the normal brain. So I think your treatment strategy should be not only focusing just on MS specific things, but also on generalized brain health. I think it would be folly not to encourage our patients to live a brain healthy lifestyle. Stop smoking, prevent comorbidities, treat comorbidities, get them to lose weight, potentially promote certain diets if you believe in the dietary have the hacking hypothesis, etc. So I think you can be proactive and not disappoint your patients by sending them away with no advice.
Gavin, I agree with you, but I think we are very fortunate because we are all seeing very, very educated patients. The great majority of my patients know very well what it is all about. They come to me generally with a very healthy lifestyle. They control the amount of drink, they control the amount of smoke. But the patient wants a treatment. So I was being very, very focused on the treatment question. And the treatment question is that we feel
that's because you work in Cambridge, Stefano.
Yeah.
As I say, come to East London.
Where people don't at all do any of those things.
Yeah.
No, I think I'm a little bit more pessimistic about the anti-inflammatories. I think they may have some effect. I think it's going to be difficult to persuade people with progressive MS to stay on them, because I think they're not going to notice much effect over time. They're going to notice side effect, but they're not going to notice effect. It's very difficult to see how slowly you're getting worse if you haven't got another you to compare against. I think it's going to be tricky. And I honestly think that will have a bit of an impact, but I think there'll be much more impact from actually going in with proper neuroprotective drugs, whether they are directly neuroprotective, pro-energetic, pro-remyelination. I don't really mind, probably a combination of all of those three. So, if people get massively disappointed by not fulfilling the criteria for these new drugs, I tend to say to them that I'm not sure that they're going to be miracles. The thing about being patient is that they quite reasonably say that it will be too late for them. And I think in many ways they might be right.
But I think the message Anna, the message we've got to give the people at the Progressive MS Alliance, the MS Society, the pharmaceutical industry, we're all going into the new era, which I will think are going to be combination therapy trials with add-on drugs to target these processes and to see if we can slow down progression.
And I think that's very hopeful. And actually, to be honest, the people who are perhaps asking about the research, who are very disabled in wheelchairs, who are unlikely to benefit much from these, are often really generous and just saying that they are really interested in the research. They're really pleased it's actually positive, and that they're really happy for the next generation. So we have very generous patients, I think.
And I think that's kind of managing expectation. We've got nothing to offer them at the moment, but we are working on it. And now there's a question.
I'd quite like to say that we never have nothing to offer them. I think I agree with you on that one. We always have something to offer, and that might be rehab, that might be bladder care, that might be nursing care, but I never think that we have nothing to offer them.
I think it's difficult to study dietary interventions and that, but maybe in the future we'll have a biomarkers or observational biomarker studies where we could do dietary interventions and study them properly, because it's very difficult to do randomized trials with diet. Okay, I think we've run out of time. I'd like to thank everybody, Stefano, Ruth, Anna. I think the message that comes across from me as the chair of this is that there's an extremely active field in unpacking the biology, and we are unpacking the biology, and we are delivering therapeutic targets, and there are drugs to target those therapeutic targets. We've got a little bit more skepticism around whether or not our trial design is going to give us proof of biology or reliable outcomes, and I think that's obviously is an area that needs a lot of work. But going forward, there are trials happening, and I think that's the positive. We are addressing the neuroprotection and neurorestoration, and I think Ruth's future vision is that we're not too far away from prevention trials, and we have to prepare for them. And so, if Ruth was in charge of the MS Society funding model, she would be saying, let's get some grants out there to prepare the field for our first prevention trials. Thank you very much.